High in the rugged mountains of northern Persia, where snow caps the jagged peaks and ancient trails vanish into mist, a fortress stood that would come to haunt the minds of kings and caliphs alike. It was called Alamut, Eagle's Nest, and from its stone terraces and fortified towers, a new order was born. This was the stronghold of the Nizari Ismailis, a breakaway sect of Shia Islam, and the birthplace of what would become known to the medieval West as the Assassins. The man who claimed Alamut for this purpose was Hasan-i Sabbah, a figure shrouded in equal parts mystery and reverence. A theologian, mathematician, and master of strategy, Hasan transformed Alamut into more than a fortress. He made it the ideological heart of a revolutionary movement. From here, he spread his vision of resistance against the Seljuk Empire, a power that, though Muslim, was viewed by the Nizaris as corrupt and illegitimate. Hasan did not command great armies. He had no cavalry, no siege engines, no fleets. What he had was discipline, devotion, and a network of young men trained not just in arms, but in ideology. These men were known as the fidai, those who would sacrifice themselves for the cause. Over decades, they became infamous throughout the Islamic world and Christendom alike for their singular method of attack: surgical, symbolic assassinations of high-profile figures. Their targets were not chosen at random. They were viziers, generals, scholars, and religious leaders, anyone seen as a threat to the Nizari cause. And the fidai did not strike from afar. They approached in public, often disguised as beggars or clerics, and plunged their daggers with such precision that the victim rarely had time to cry out. Then, almost always, they were cut down where they stood, making no attempt to flee. To Hasan and his followers, theirs was not suicide but martyrdom. What terrified their enemies even more than the killings was the knowledge that the assassins could reach anyone. No fortress was safe. No palace was secure. The mere rumor of a Nizari operative in a city was enough to cause panic, tighten security, and provoke purges. This psychological warfare was as powerful as any blade. Rulers began sleeping with guards at their doors, and their trusted servants were suddenly viewed with suspicion. Alamut itself was never merely a base of operations. It was a university, a training ground, a citadel of faith. New recruits were brought up the winding trails to the fortress, where they underwent years of spiritual and military education. They studied not only the Quran but also philosophy, astronomy, logic, and languages. They learned how to blend in among merchants, pilgrims, and palace staff. They were taught to observe patiently, to strike with clarity, and to accept death not as an end, but a fulfillment. The origins of the order trace back to the schisms that followed the death of the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir in 1094. The Ismaili community fractured between those who followed his son Nizar and those who backed his younger brother al-Mustali. Hasan-i Sabbah, a passionate adherent of Nizar's claim, found himself at odds with the dominant branch of Ismailism based in Cairo. Cast out and hunted, he sought refuge and resolution in the mountains of Dalam, where the seeds of his rebellion took root. It was in 1090 that Hasan captured Alamut, not by siege, but by guile. The local commander was converted or subverted, and the castle changed hands without a battle. From there, Hasan began building the network that would become the backbone of the Nizari state, a constellation of mountain fortresses linked by couriers and sworn oaths, a silent empire hidden in the folds of Persia's peaks. These fortresses were not isolated redoubts. They were strategically placed to oversee trade routes, valleys, and passes. Their architecture blended with the terrain, and their defenses were built to repel far superior forces. Most importantly, they were symbols, emblems of the possibility that a small, committed minority could carve out a space beyond the reach of empire. The Fidai were its agents, Alamut its beating heart, and Hasan its mind. As word of their actions spread, so too did the legends. European crusaders heard tales of the old man of the mountain, who sent young men to kill with promises of paradise. Marco Polo would later recount that these killers were drugged and shown a garden of delights, then told they could return only by dying in service to their master. Whether these stories were inventions, misunderstandings, or deliberate propaganda remains debated, but their power was undeniable. What is known for certain is that the assassins mastered the art of perception. They allowed rumors to flourish when it suited them, and they knew that fear, once planted, would grow without tending. Their strategic use of terror had a multiplier effect. A single dagger in the right place could shift alliances, delay military campaigns, or unseat governors. They turned their weakness, lack of numbers, into strength by operating in the minds of their enemies. Their tactics, while brutal, were highly selective. Unlike bandits or warlords, the Nizari did not engage in wanton slaughter. Their killings were precise, almost ritualistic. They targeted not soldiers, but symbols of authority. It was a form of asymmetric warfare centuries ahead of its time. To the Nizari, these acts were not murders, they were executions. Each victim had, in their eyes, committed injustice against the faith or threatened their survival. And because their agents never tried to escape, in the early years, the assassins focused primarily on their Muslim adversaries, particularly the Seljuk Turks who sought to stamp out Ismailism. Viziers and judges, military commanders and provincial governors, all found themselves within reach of a Fidai blade. But in time, the network expanded to Syria, where a new frontier opened against both crusaders and rival Islamic factions. The fortress of Masyaf, deep in the Syrian mountains, became a second stronghold, and under the leadership of men like Masyaf, like Alamut, became a symbol. It projected not only military strength, but ideological resilience. From its towers, messengers rode to deliver orders, recruits arrived to be initiated, and visitors came, some in peace, some in chains. It was here that a famous confrontation occurred between the Nizari leader and the Crusader warlord Raymond of Tripoli, whose camp awoke one morning to find a dagger embedded in his tent with a note warning him to withdraw. He did. Such tales contributed to the growing mystique of the assassins. To outsiders, they were both fascinating and terrifying. They seemed to belong to no country, serve no king, answer no law but their own. Yet within their communities, they were governed by strict rules, spiritual obligations, and a shared sense of purpose. They saw themselves not as villains but as vanguards of a truer Islam, preserving it in secret while the world succumbed to tyranny and compromise. Their strength lay not only in their methods, but in their discipline. The Fidai were forbidden from acting without direct command. They trained for years, sometimes never called upon to strike. Their lives were not glamorous. They lived in shadow, often under assumed identities, far from Alamut or Masyaf. Yet when summoned, they obeyed without hesitation. To them, death was not failure, it was fulfillment. This unity of purpose allowed the Nizari state to endure against odds that should have crushed it. For decades they maintained autonomy in a landscape crowded with enemies. Seljuk sultans, Abbasid caliphs, crusader barons, all failed to eliminate them. The assassins held their mountain fortresses, not by strength of arms alone, but by cultivating a reputation so potent that it became armor. Still, the pressure never ceased. The larger Muslim world regarded them as heretics. Sunni theologians denounced them. Armies were raised to destroy them. At times they faced starvation under siege. Yet Alamut stood, Masyaf endured, and in the shadows of great empires the dagger remained sharp. As time wore on, their influence began to wane, not from defeat, but from shifting politics. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century would eventually sweep across Persia and Syria, altering the balance of power across the Islamic world. For the assassins, the arrival of the Mongols would mark the beginning of the end. But long before that, they had already reshaped the very notion of resistance. The Mongols, under Hulagu Khan, approached the mountains of Persia with a reputation for annihilation. They had already razed cities, crushed caliphates, and shattered dynasties. In 1256, they turned their attention to Alamut. By this time, the leadership of the assassins had passed through several hands, and the once rigid discipline had begun to erode. The current Grand Master, Ruken al-Din Kursha, faced an impossible choice: resist and face obliteration, or surrender and hope for mercy. The Mongols did not believe in mercy. Despite negotiations and temporary truces, Hulagu's forces attacked. Alamut, the impregnable fortress, fell after a brief siege. The legendary library that Hasan-i Sabbah had assembled, filled with texts on science, philosophy, and theology, was burned. The towers were torn down. The assassins, who had defied sultans and caliphs, could not withstand the fury of the Mongol horde. Other strongholds followed, one by one, until the Nizari state in Persia ceased to exist. In Syria, a remnant of the order held on longer, maintaining Masyaf and a few outposts through diplomacy and tribute. They played crusader against Muslim, Muslim against crusader, surviving by staying useful. But without Alamut, the heart of their ideology and command, they were a body without a pulse. Over time, their influence faded, and by the early 14th century, they were little more than a memory. And yet, what a memory it was! The legacy of the assassins outlived their fortresses, their leaders, and their cause. European chroniclers, often mystified by what they had encountered, transformed the Nizari into a symbol, part fact, part fantasy. The very word assassin entered Western languages not as a title of honor, but as a synonym for murder. The nuances of belief, the context of resistance, the structure of the movement, all were flattened into a myth of silent killers who struck without warning and vanished like ghosts. Writers like Marco Polo embellished the legend, telling of secret gardens, enchanted paradises, and blind obedience. They spoke of young men drugged and manipulated, shown delights before being sent to kill. While such stories were likely exaggerations or outright fabrications, they found fertile ground in the European imagination. The idea of an order of mystical killers devoted to a hidden master fed into the fears and fascinations of a continent already obsessed with religious secrecy and political. Centuries later, the myth of the assassins would be revived in novels, films, and games. Their name would be invoked by revolutionaries and secret societies. Their methods, stealth, precision, symbolism, would be studied by insurgents and intelligence agencies alike. But behind all this remains the historical truth that in the harshest terrain, at the edge of power, a group of believers carved out an idea. That idea, though bloodied and buried, never quite died. In modern-day Iran, the ruins of Alamut still cling to the mountainside, wind-scoured and sun-bleached. Tourists climb its broken steps, stare out over the valley, and try to imagine what once stood there. Stones remain, but the vision behind them is harder to see. It was a vision of resistance through intelligence, of power wielded without armies, of faith forged into strategy. What Hasan-i Sabbah built was not just a sect or a fortress, it was a philosophy made stone. His legacy cannot be measured in victories or territories, but in the enduring question he posed to the empires of his day. What if the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the largest army, but the one you cannot see? The story of the assassins cannot be fully told without understanding the ideological foundations that sustained them. At its core, the Nizari movement was not merely political, it was deeply spiritual, grounded in a distinctive interpretation of Islam that emphasized inner knowledge, hidden truths, and loyalty to the Imam. Unlike Sunni orthodoxy, which stressed external practice and consensus, the Nizaris embraced esotericism. They believed that beneath the surface of religious law lay deeper meanings, and that only the Imam, God's appointed guide, could reveal them. This devotion to the Imam gave the assassins a sense of purpose that transcended the usual motivations for power. Hasan-i Sabbah preached not conquest, but enlightenment. His early writings spoke of purification through knowledge, of discipline as a path to truth. His rejection of worldly pleasures, including alcohol and luxury, became legendary. He was said to have executed his own son for breaking the rules, a story that, whether true or apocryphal, reinforced his image as a man who placed principles above all. Such a system required more than charisma. It required structure. Alamut became a center of learning, a repository of theological and philosophical debate. The assassins translated texts from Greek, Persian, and Arabic. They preserved works that might otherwise have been lost in the chaos of war and sectarian strife. While their enemies portrayed them as mad fanatics, they were in fact among the most literate and intellectually active communities of their time. It is this paradox that continues to fascinate scholars, that a group so feared for its violence was also a haven for scholarship, that a sect known for assassinations also produced poetry, astronomy, and logic. Within their mountain fortresses, the Fida'i were not merely trained to kill, they were taught to think, to reflect, and to serve a cause greater than themselves. This is not to romanticize them. The assassins did kill. They spread fear. They enforced loyalty through secrecy and hierarchy. But they also carved out a space for a minority faith in a hostile world. Their survival for over a century speaks not just to their blades, but to their minds. In many ways, they anticipated the modern intelligence agency more than the medieval army. Their strength was in networks, not battalions, in messages passed across deserts and mountains, in agents embedded in cities far from home. Their successes came not through brute force, but through timing, subtlety, and the ability to shape perception. Centuries later, historians would debate how much of their story was real and how much invention. But the assassins themselves understood the power of narrative. They allowed legends to grow because they knew that fear could be more potent than armies. They understood that mystery could protect where walls could not. And so, when we speak of Alamut, we speak not only of a place, but of an idea, that knowledge is a form of resistance, that belief can be weaponized, and that the smallest blade in the right hands can alter the fate of empires. While the story of the assassins is often centered on Persia and the fortress of Alamut, their influence in Syria was equally significant, and in some ways more entangled with the politics of the Crusader era. By the mid-12th century, the Nizari presence in Syria had solidified through a network of smaller fortresses, with Masyaf serving as the principal stronghold. From this base, they interacted with an astonishing array of players: Sunni rulers, Shia factions, Crusader lords, and even Christian imams. The most famous Syrian Nizari leader was Rashid al-Din Sinan, often known in Western sources as the Old Man of the Mountain. He ruled from Masyaf in semi-independence from the Persian branch of the order, a sign of both the reach and flexibility of the Nizari network. Rashid was charismatic and enigmatic, capable of both ruthless precision and surprising diplomacy. He oversaw assassinations that echoed across the Levant and made alliances when it served his people's survival. One of the most striking episodes involving the Syrian assassins was their relationship with the Crusader states. While Christians and Muslims were engaged in a broader holy war, the assassins carved their own path, sometimes aligning with Crusaders against mutual enemies. At times, they paid tribute to Crusader lords. At others, they arranged the deaths of those very same lords. Their actions were driven not by ideology, but by necessity and strategy. The case of Conrad of Montferrat is emblematic. In 1192, during the Third Crusade, Conrad, then King of Jerusalem, was assassinated by two fidei disguised as monks. The killing sent shockwaves through Europe and sparked immediate speculation about who had ordered the hit. Some blamed Richard the Lionheart. Others pointed to rival factions within the Crusader ranks. But the hand that struck was Nizari. The reasons remain murky, but the message was clear. No throne was beyond their reach. Rashid al-Din Sinan's name became synonymous with mystery. European chroniclers portrayed him as a sorcerer, capable of mind control and illusions. These accounts, tinged with fear and fantasy, contributed to the legend of the assassins as more than men, almost supernatural forces. But within his own community, Rashid was seen as a leader who preserved their autonomy in a dangerous world, who wielded death not for pleasure but for protection. His rule was not without challenges. The assassins in Syria were a minority within a minority, constantly under pressure from surrounding powers. Their fortresses were small, their numbers limited. They relied on stealth, subterfuge, and diplomacy to maintain their position. Yet, under Rashid's leadership, they held their ground for decades, outlasting warlords and sultans alike. When Rashid died in 1193, the order did not collapse, but the unique authority he had wielded proved difficult to replace. The Syrian branch continued to function, but its autonomy gradually diminished. Over time, it became more reliant on directives from Persia and less capable of independent action. Still, the memory of Rashid al-Din Sinan endured. In both Eastern and Western sources, he remained a figure of fascination, part warlord, part philosopher, part ghost. He represented a time when the assassins were not just hidden blades in the night, but a force that shaped the politics of nations. His legacy, like that of Hasan-i Sabbah, was not measured in territory, but in impact. The assassins had no cities, no armies, no flags. Yet they moved through the corridors of power, altering the course of history with whispers and knives. Their survival, for over a century in the midst of constant hostility, was a testament not only to their methods, but to their mastery of timing, patience, and perception. As the centuries passed, the memory of the assassins took on a life of its own. Long after their political power waned and their fortresses crumbled, the legend persisted, fed by travelers' tales, enemy propaganda, and the eerie silence that surrounded their true beliefs. By the time of the Renaissance, they had become archetypes of the secret killer, the hidden hand behind great events, and the unknowable cult that defied reason and empire alike. In Europe, this myth was shaped in part by the writings of travelers like Marco Polo, whose descriptions, though vivid, were likely based more on rumor than first-hand knowledge. Polo claimed that the old man of the mountain maintained a secret garden of delights, where young men were seduced with visions of paradise before being dispatched on missions. These stories appealed to the European imagination, already fascinated with the exotic and the dangerous. They gave the assassins an aura of mystery but while the legends grew wilder, scholars in the Islamic world continued to grapple with the reality of the Nizari state. Sunni historians, generally hostile to Shia sects, often painted the assassins as dangerous heretics, deceivers who used religion as a cover for ambition. Yet even their harshest critics could not ignore their discipline, resilience, and strategic genius. Over time, as sectarian lines hardened, the historical role of the Nizaris was pushed to the margins, overshadowed by more Dom. Still, traces of their influence persisted in unexpected ways. The idea that knowledge could be a weapon, that small groups could defy empires, and that belief itself could be a form of resistance. These were ideas with enduring appeal. In times of upheaval, the assassins were sometimes reimagined by revolutionary thinkers, freedom fighters, and insurgents seeking models of effective rebellion. In literature, too, they found new life. Romanticized in poems, novels, and eventually films, the assassins were cast variously as noble avengers, brainwashed zealots, or tragic figures caught in a web of ideology and betrayal. Each retelling added layers to the myth, obscuring the historical reality but also keeping the memory alive. Even as their original mission faded into the background, the image of the dagger in the dark retained its power. Perhaps what makes the legacy of the assassins so potent is its paradox. They were both feared and admired, reviled and revered. They used violence, yet cultivated knowledge. They rejected empire, yet built a network of power that spanned regions and generations. They disappeared from history, yet refused to be forgotten. Their descendants, the modern Ismaili community, long ago moved beyond the age of the fortress and the dagger. Today, Ismailis are known more for philanthropy, education, and civic engagement than for resistance or secrecy. But the story of their ancestors remains a point of cultural memory, a reminder of what it took to survive in a world that offered no mercy to those who believed differently. And in the ruins of Alamut, where stone paths still wind through the mountain mist, visitors walk where Fida'i once trained, where scholars once debated, and where a man named Hassan dared to imagine a new order in defiance of kings. They walk not just through history, but through legend, through a story that, for all its violence and mystery, speaks to the human hunger for meaning, for identity, and for freedom. The assassins are gone, their blades are rust, their towers are ruins. But their question remains: what is power, and who truly holds it? In the shadowed places of the world, that question still echoes. One of the more intriguing aspects of the Nizari assassins' history is how deeply misunderstood they were by the civilizations that encountered them. To the Seljuks, and later the Mongols, they were heretics and rebels, to be crushed without mercy. To the Crusaders, they were mysterious enemies, or uneasy allies, who seemed to follow no known code. And to medieval Europe, hearing only distant echoes of their deeds, they were something closer to myth than men. This distance allowed the legend to mutate. The assassin became a stock figure in medieval storytelling, a killer without remorse, manipulated by a distant master, driven by promises of paradise. This image bore little resemblance to the disciplined, ideologically motivated Fida'i who trained for years and acted only on direct command. But myths have their own momentum, and the name assassin became unmoored from its origins, drifting into the realm of metaphor. Ironically, what was lost in this transformation was the very thing that made the Nizaris unique: their blend of intellect and action, their fusion of belief and strategy. They were not mindless instruments of violence. They were scholars, planners, and agents of a cause they saw as just. They read, wrote, debated, and dreamed, and they acted with surgical precision when their faith demanded it. The West's misinterpretation was not merely poetic. It had real consequences. As the term assassin entered European languages, it became synonymous with cowardice, deceit, and treachery. This fed into Orientalist stereotypes of the dangerous East, reinforcing colonial attitudes that would later shape foreign policy, scholarship, and literature. The real assassins were buried beneath centuries of mischaracterization. In the Islamic world, the process was different but no less distorting. The Sunni majority, hostile to Shia sects and particularly to esoteric offshoots like the Nizaris, often treated the assassins as a cautionary tale. They were invoked as examples of how heresy led to violence, how deviation from orthodoxy resulted in chaos. Rarely were they studied for what they accomplished, only for what they threatened. Yet in rare instances, their memory was preserved with more nuance. Some historians, particularly within Shia communities, saw in the Nizaris a model of perseverance. Others admired their use of intelligence over force, their ability to survive without the backing of a state, their skill in shaping outcomes from the shadows. In these accounts, the assassins were not heroes or villains. They were actors in a grand drama, responding to a world that gave them few choices. This tension between how the assassins saw themselves and how others saw them defines much of their legacy. It also makes them an ideal subject for reflection in the modern age. In a time when information is power, when small groups can shape vast events, and when belief continues to drive both creation and destruction, the story of the assassins feels strangely current. They remind us that history is rarely as clean as we wish it to be, that those we call terrorists may see themselves as martyrs, that the line between resistance and fanaticism is often drawn by the victors, and that power, when wielded with patience and precision, can reshape the world without ever raising an army. In this way, the assassins endure, not just in books or games or ruins, but in the questions they force us to ask about loyalty, about violence, about how far we are willing to go for what we believe. In tracing the story of the assassins, one must also consider the physical world they inhabited. The geography of their domain was not accidental. It shaped their philosophy, their strategy, and their survival. The mountains of northern Persia and Syria offered both sanctuary and challenge. These were regions of isolation, where travel was difficult, supply lines fragile, and communication slow. But for the assassins, this very harshness became a tool. Fortresses like Alamut, Masyaf, and others were chosen not merely for defensibility, but for their symbolic separation from the powers of the plains. The cities belonged to the empires, the seats of sultans, caliphs, and governors. The mountains, by contrast, were wild, unknowable, and spiritually resonant. From high above, the assassins could watch the world they defied, far enough to be safe, yet close enough to strike. The architecture of these fortresses reflected their philosophy, modest, austere, and precise. They lacked the opulence of royal palaces or the grandiosity of cathedral-like mosques. Instead, they were functional, designed for sustainability, secrecy, and endurance. Water cisterns, underground storage rooms, narrow staircases, and defensible gates spoke of a people who expected to be besieged, who saw siege not as crisis, but as routine. Daily life in such fortresses was disciplined. Recruits adhered to strict codes of behavior. Meals were communal, rituals observed with regularity, and study was constant. There was no room for luxury or idleness. The very environment, remote, cold, and unforgiving, reinforced a sense of purpose. Those who lived there did so not by accident, but by conviction. The isolation also fostered independence. While the Nizari order had a clear hierarchy, with the Grand Master at its peak, local commanders often operated with significant autonomy. They adapted to regional politics, formed temporary alliances, and managed their fortresses according to local needs. This decentralized model helped the assassins survive in diverse environments and respond flexibly to threats. But it also carried risks. As generations passed, communication between fortresses could falter. Successors to Hasan-i Sabbah lacked his clarity of vision. Some commanders grew ambitious, others complacent. The discipline that had once defined the order sometimes gave way to internal strife. In the face of external pressure, from the Seljuks, the Crusaders, or the Mongols, this fragmentation proved dangerous. Still, the geographical memory of the assassins remains embedded in the land. Even today, the ruins of their castles stand as silent witnesses to a different kind of power. Not the grandeur of empire, but the resilience of belief. Not domination, but defiance. Visitors who climb the broken paths to Alamut or Masyaf often speak of the silence that greets them. There are no tour guides in costume, no reenactments or souvenir shops, only stone, wind, and sky. And in that silence, a story lingers, not of conquest, but of conviction. Of a people who chose the heights not to rule from above, but to live beyond reach. Their world was small, but their vision vast. From mountaintop to mountaintop, they forged a network more durable than armies, more enduring than kings. They left no monuments, only memory. And perhaps that is the greatest monument of all. The methods employed by the assassins were not simply tools of destruction. They were instruments of political engineering. Each act of assassination was designed not only to remove a threat, but to send a message. That message was often tailored to a specific audience, a sultan hesitating to negotiate, a local lord resisting tribute, or a population on the verge of rebellion. These killings were never random. They were calibrated to alter the balance of power without provoking open war. One of the order's most striking accomplishments was its ability to create deterrence. The fear of being targeted was enough to influence decisions at court, shift allegiances, and suppress military campaigns. Rulers who might otherwise have crushed the Nizaris found themselves hesitating, reconsidering, negotiating. The assassins, few in number, had managed to achieve one of the rarest conditions in medieval politics, respect born not from wealth or armies, but from fear and precision. And yet they never relied on fear alone. Diplomacy was an essential aspect of their survival. The assassins maintained envoys, negotiated truces, and paid tributes when necessary. They understood the value of appearing useful to their neighbors, of offering services, intelligence, negotiation, or even covert action that could not be obtained elsewhere. In this way, they embedded themselves into the political fabric of the region, becoming indispensable even to those who feared them. Their ability to navigate the complexities of Crusader-Muslim relations is particularly noteworthy. At a time when religious warfare defined the age, the assassins often operated outside these binary divisions. They killed Christians and Muslims alike, not for their faith, but for their threat to the Nizari cause. They forged short-term alliances with both sides, demonstrating a pragmatism that confounded their contemporaries. This pragmatism extended to their internal administration as well. The Nizari state maintained records, collected taxes, and provided social services within its territory. It functioned as a parallel polity, operating under a spiritual mandate but grounded in administrative realism. Its survival required more than belief. It required governance, infrastructure, and adaptability. At the heart of this system was the concept of taqiyya, religious dissimulation. In a world hostile to their beliefs, the Nizaris adopted the practice of outward conformity to avoid persecution. This allowed them to operate in hostile territory, to pass as Sunnis or neutral actors, and to preserve their faith in private. While controversial, taqiyya was essential to their resilience. It allowed them to survive in places where open adherence would have meant death. This blend of openness and secrecy, of engagement and withdrawal, defined the Nizari strategy. It allowed them to remain unpredictable, to move between visibility and invisibility. They were present, yet elusive, feared, yet often welcomed. It was a precarious existence, but for over a century it worked. The assassins understood something that many larger powers forgot, that the perception of power can be more important than power itself. They crafted that perception carefully, maintaining the mystique of omnipresence. Their agents might be anywhere, their reach unlimited, their loyalty unshakable. And in an age of uncertainty, that illusion was often enough. Even today, the phrase "the dagger in the dark" evokes something more than violence. It speaks of hidden influence, of silent forces shaping events from behind the veil. That was the assassin's true domain. Not the battlefield, but the space between decisions. Not the war, but the mind of the king who hesitated. The legacy of the assassins extends beyond their historical deeds. It lives in the very way we think about secrecy, networks, and resistance. As empires fell and rose, as religions spread and fractured, the idea of the small, disciplined, hidden group persisted in collective memory. It was the archetype of the resistance cell, the underground movement, the watchful few who influenced the many. In this sense, the assassins became a cultural metaphor, not just in the West, where their legend inspired everything from romantic fiction to modern video games, but also in the Middle East, where their name still evokes a mixture of reverence and fear. They symbolize a kind of ultimate outsider, an entity that refuses submission, that carves space where none exists, that survives by knowing more and revealing less. Their story raises difficult questions. Can violence ever be justified in the name of belief? When does resistance become fanaticism? Can secrecy be virtuous, or is it inherently corrosive? The assassins, who lived entirely within these paradoxes, offer no easy answers. Only the unsettling realization that history is shaped as much by those in the shadows as those on thrones. In modern popular culture, their image has been recast many times. The assassin is now often a solitary figure cloaked in mystery, navigating corrupt systems to reveal hidden truths. While far removed from the historical Nizari, this image resonates because it taps into something real, the longing for agency in a world of overwhelming structures. That longing is not new. It is what gave rise to the original movement. Hasan-i Sabbah did not begin with an army. He began with a vision of spiritual purity, of intellectual rigor, of resistance through belief. That vision, radical in its time, found followers willing to risk everything to see it realized. Their actions may shock us. Their theology may baffle us. But their determination, their discipline, their ability to endure, these are qualities that continue to echo through time. There is something deeply human in their story. It is not merely one of bloodshed and plots, but of searching for meaning in a hostile world, for truth amid lies, for a place to stand when every door is barred. The assassins found their place not by force of arms, but by force of will. And so, when we look back on their history, we do so not only with the gaze of scholars or skeptics, but with the recognition that the questions they raised are still with us. Who decides what is just? What do we owe to belief? And what are we willing to sacrifice for a world we may never live to see? The assassins chose clarity over comfort, conviction over compromise. Whether they were right or wrong is for history to debate. But their story remains, a thread in the vast fabric of human struggle, a whisper in the mountains, a shadow on the path to power. And in that shadow, we find ourselves asking, as they once did, what it means to act in the dark, and whether the darkness is within us or around us. The Nizari assassins are remembered today not only for their acts, but for the unique model of resistance they pioneered, a model rooted in precision, discipline, and a radical reframing of power. They did not seek to conquer vast territories or build sprawling empires. Their ambition was not measured in land, but in leverage. They understood that a single well-placed act could shift the course of a battle, a war, even a reign. This approach made them a subject of fascination and imitation. Across centuries, groups facing insurmountable odds have looked to the assassins as a template. Their tactics have been studied by revolutionaries and insurgents, by political movements and covert organizations. Not because they glorified violence, but because they demonstrated that power is not always a matter of numbers, it is also a matter of knowledge, timing, and resolve. But the assassins were more than tacticians. They were builders of a parallel society, one that prioritized education, loyalty, and belief. In an age when literacy was rare, their members read and copied texts. In a time when conformity was enforced with the sword, they dared to believe differently. Their secrecy was not cowardice, but protection. Their silence, a form of defiance. It is worth remembering that the Nizaris were persecuted not simply because they were violent, but because they were different. Their version of Islam emphasized inner meaning over outward ritual, loyalty to a living imam over allegiance to distant caliphs. In many ways, they represented a challenge not only to political authority, but to religious orthodoxy. That made them dangerous, not just to rulers, but to the worldview those rulers upheld. And yet, despite this, they endured. Through siege and betrayal, through slander and suppression, they held fast. Even as their fortresses fell, their legacy survived. In whispered stories, in demonized chronicles, in the very language we use today. The term assassin has lost its original context, but the echo of that mountain order remains. We see it in literature, in film, in the architecture of conspiracy. We feel it in the allure of the hidden, the disciplined, the unyielding. The assassins have become icons, not of violence, but of intent, of sacrifice, of a certain kind of clarity that sees through the illusion of invincibility surrounding kings and emperors. Their story is not clean. It is filled with contradictions. They were killers who preserved knowledge, rebels who built order, zealots who embraced doubt. But in that messiness lies their truth. They were, above all, human, flawed-driven, brilliant, afraid. And that, perhaps, is why their story endures. Because we, too, live in a world of shifting powers and fragile truths. We, too, are caught between what is and what might be. And we, too, must choose how we respond. The assassins chose belief, action, and silence. What we choose is up to us, but if we listen closely, we may still hear their footsteps in the stone corridors of Alamut, still feel the weight of their question. How do you fight a world that does not see you? They answered not with armies, but with intention. Not with noise, but with presence. And though they are long gone, their shadow remains, etched into the very mountains that once gave them shelter. Modern historians have worked to peel back the layers of legend that obscure the Nizari assassins, to rediscover what was real and what was myth. In doing so, they have painted a more complex and compelling portrait of a community that defied the conventions of its time. Far from being mere fanatics or puppets, the assassins were part of a sophisticated religious and political network with deep intellectual roots. Primary sources from within the Ismaili tradition, long overlooked or inaccessible, have shed new light on the inner workings of the Nizari state. These documents reveal not only military operations, but theological debates, administrative practices, and personal correspondences between leaders. What emerges is not a shadowy cult, but a functioning society. Hierarchical, yes, but also dynamic and deeply invested in education and spiritual development. Archaeological work at sites like Alamut and Masyaf has further helped separate fact from fiction. Excavations have uncovered remnants of libraries, defensive structures, and agricultural systems. These findings underscore how the Nizaris adapted to their environment and invested in long-term sustainability. They were not merely hiding from the world, they were building within it. This scholarly reassessment has important implications. It challenges us to rethink how we view marginalized or misunderstood groups in history. The Nizaris were written about almost exclusively by their enemies, and those accounts, while dramatic, were often biased. Only by including Ismaili voices can we begin to understand the full story. And in doing so, we are reminded that history is not just a record of what happened, but of who gets to tell it. The rehabilitation of the assassin's image is not about excusing their violence. Rather, it is about context. About seeing them not as aberrations, but as products of their time, reacting to oppression, building alternatives, surviving through ingenuity. It is about acknowledging their humanity, their flaws, and their aspirations. In academic circles, the study of the Nizaris now intersects with broader themes: minority survival, state formation, esoteric theology, and asymmetric warfare. Their history offers lessons for political science, religious studies, and military strategy. It demonstrates how belief systems can become frameworks for governance, how secrecy can be both shield and sword, and how small groups can challenge hegemonic structures. Outside the academy, the fascination continues. Popular media reimagines the assassins again and again, often reducing them to silent killers or cloaked rebels. These representations may lack nuance, but they speak to something enduring: the allure of the hidden, the disciplined, the defiant. Even stripped of context, the image holds power. But behind that image lies a real history, one more interesting than any fiction. A history of visionaries and soldiers, of scribes and spies, of defeats and quiet triumphs. A history that asks hard questions about power, loyalty, and the cost of survival. As we move further from the time of the assassins, we gain perspective, but we also risk losing connection. The mountains they once ruled are still there. The stones still hold the shape of what they built. And if we listen, we might still hear the echoes of their footsteps, the soft murmur of studied voices, the silence before the strike. It is a history not of spectacle, but of presence, not of domination, but of endurance. And in that endurance, the assassins remain with us, not in myth, but in memory. As the medieval world gave way to the modern, the direct memory of the assassins faded. Their strongholds crumbled, their leaders vanished from political maps, and their name was repurposed by generations who no longer remembered its origins. But like many ideas forged in resistance, their legacy survived in whispers and in the shapes of things they helped define. Among modern Ismailis, particularly those descended from the Nizari tradition, the heritage of Alamut is not worn like a badge of conquest, but carried like a story of survival. Today, the Ismaili community is global, diverse, and focused on education, development, and intercultural dialogue. The current Imam of the Nizari Ismailis, Aga Khan IV, has been a champion of humanitarian work and cultural preservation. That such a future could grow from the ashes of a besieged mountain order is a testament to the This transformation, from secretive sect to globally engaged community, offers another way to understand the assassins, not just as warriors or conspirators, but as the early architects of a tradition that has navigated centuries of persecution and adaptation. They were never only what their enemies said. They were more than their acts of violence. They were also creators of knowledge, preservers of texts, believers in the power of ideas. It is this intellectual legacy that may prove most lasting. Alamut was not simply a military base. It was a place where faith and reason were forged together under siege. The fact that so many sought to destroy them speaks not only to fear, but to the threat their worldview posed to established orders. The assassins demonstrated that one did not need imperial sanction to shape history. That ideas, carefully guarded and boldly acted upon, could ripple through time. This is perhaps why the story of the assassins has been so enduring, not just because of the drama or the mystery, but because it touches something deeper. It reflects the perennial struggle between orthodoxy and reform, between dominance and dissent. In every age, those who challenge power from the margins are both vilified and mythologized. The assassins were among the first to make that ambiguity a strategy. Today, we live in a world where networks, ideologies, and asymmetric tactics shape our daily lives in ways that echo the past. The assassins, in their own time, anticipated this shift. They understood that visibility could be a vulnerability, that secrecy could be power, that symbolism could be more potent than swords. Their methods were born of necessity, but their lessons are timeless. In the end, the assassins ask us to reconsider what we think we know about history, about who writes it, who edits it, and who is left in its margins. They were not the first to resist from the shadows, and they will not be the last. But they remind us that even in the darkest corners of the past, there is light enough to learn by. And perhaps that is their true gift, not the blade, but the question it leaves behind. What would you sacrifice to shape the world you believe in? The ruins of Alamut still cling to the cliffs of Iran's Elburz Mountains, silent sentinels over a valley that once held the heart of a revolutionary idea. Few visitors now climb its winding paths, and fewer still understand what once pulsed behind its walls. But those who do, historians, pilgrims, and seekers, stand where the Fida'i once trained and see not only stone, but memory. To imagine Alamut in its prime is to see a convergence of mind and mission. In the cold air of the highlands, men and women committed to a cause greater than themselves studied scripture, sharpened their blades, and debated the meaning of justice. This was not a place of comfort, but of clarity. Its strength lay not in its walls, but in the will of those who called it home. Modernity has little patience for such convictions. In a world of distraction, the discipline of the assassins can seem alien. In a time of mass politics and information overload, their precise, targeted interventions appear almost surgical. Yet perhaps this is why their story still resonates. They were not many, but they were focused. They were not loud, but they were heard. Their model was not sustainable forever. It relied on secrecy, isolation, and a fragile network of loyalty. When the Mongols came, with overwhelming force and no tolerance for negotiation, the Nizari experiment in autonomy was doomed. Yet even in destruction, they achieved something rare. They altered how people understood power. They made rulers look over their shoulders. They made empires hesitate. And that hesitation is a kind of legacy. It is the recognition that even in a world of swords and banners, something quieter, something smaller, could still matter. That meaning could be forged in retreat, that resilience could live in refusal. To stand at Alamut today is to confront the silence left behind. It is a silence filled not with failure, but with questions. What did these people die for? What did they preserve? What do we forget when we accept only the loudest voices in history? Some say the assassins disappeared. Others say they were absorbed, diluted, or evolved. But perhaps they did not vanish at all. Perhaps they became part of the landscape, not just of mountains, but of thought, of resistance that does not always need to speak, of presence that endures, even in absence. This is not to glorify violence. The assassins killed, and they did so with purpose. But they also built, preserved, and imagined. Their story is not one of endless war, but of intense focus, not of conquest, but of conviction. And in that conviction lies their relevance. In a world that often confuses noise with power, the assassins remind us that the deepest changes begin not with crowds, but with questions, not with declarations, but with decisions, not with armies, but with ideas. Alamut may be stone now, but its story is not buried. It waits in books and memories, in ruins and reflections, for those willing to listen. And when they do, they will hear more than the echoes of a forgotten fortress. They will hear the heartbeat of an idea that once challenged the world, and still might. The story of the assassins ends not with a climactic battle or a final manifesto, but with dispersion. As the Mongols swept across Persia and Syria, they dismantled the physical structures of the Nizari state. Fortresses were razed, libraries burned, and communities scattered. The survivors fled to more remote areas or blended into the general populace, practicing their faith in secret, holding to their traditions behind closed doors. But even in this dispersal, the essence of their legacy remained intact. In the face of annihilation, they adapted. In the aftermath of collapse, they endured. And over centuries, they evolved into something new. The Nizari Ismailis did not vanish, they transformed. From shadow warriors to global citizens, from hidden fortresses to open institutions, their journey did not end. It simply changed form. Today, their legacy is embodied in the work of educational foundations, cultural preservation, and social development projects. The spirit of Alamut, its dedication to knowledge, discipline, and belief, lives on in ways that Hasan-i Sabbah might never have imagined, yet might deeply recognize. For the heart of his vision was always more than stone. It was an idea that the world could be understood, challenged, and shaped by those committed enough to try. And that is what remains most powerful about the assassins. Not their daggers, but their daring. Not their secrecy, but their strategy. Not their destruction, but their defiance. In the end, their story reminds us that history is not only made by kings and armies, it is also shaped by those who move in silence, who believe without recognition, who act without applause. The assassins were among those few. And though centuries separate us, their questions remain close. What do we believe? What will we risk? How far will we go to create the world we want? These are not just historical questions, they are present ones. And in pondering them, we do more than remember the assassins. We continue their legacy, not by mimicking their methods, but by embracing their clarity, their courage, their conviction. So let the mountains keep their silence. Let the ruins keep their secrets, but let the idea live. Let it challenge us. Let it guide us. Let it remind us that even in the darkest times, even from the narrowest margins, change is possible. That is the final lesson of Alamut. And it waits, not in stone, but in the stories we tell, and the ones we choose to live. In the centuries following the Mongol destruction of Alamut, The remaining Ismaili communities carried their traditions into new lands and new contexts. Scattered across Persia, Syria, Central Asia, and eventually the Indian subcontinent, they preserved their identity quietly, often invisibly. The trauma of the past had taught them discretion, and discretion became survival. In this long twilight of memory, the assassins were no longer a state, no longer a force of precision-striking fidai. They were families, merchants, artisans, and scholars, carrying forward a heritage no longer militant, but resilient. Their leaders no longer issued orders from fortresses, but guided their communities from the shadows of empire, offering continuity in a world of upheaval. Much of this period remains obscure to historians, as the sources grow scarcer and the lines between tradition and adaptation blur. But what is known speaks to a remarkable cultural persistence. The Ismailis maintained religious centers in remote valleys and cities alike, keeping alive their doctrine through oral transmission, manuscript copying, and careful mentorship. They blended where necessary, hid when forced, but never relinquished their core. During the Safavid era in Persia, when Shia Islam became the state religion, the Ismailis faced renewed pressure. Although theologically closer to the ruling order than the Sunnis, they remained distinct, too independent, too secretive, too historically defiant. Once again, they retreated to the margins, and once again, they endured. In India, however, a new chapter began. Migrating communities of Nizaris found opportunity and relative tolerance in the Gujarati coast and the Deccan region. Here, far from the mountains of Alamut, they began to flourish again, not through rebellion, but through integration. They became traders, court officials, and local leaders, adapting their theology to the cultural milieu of South Asia. The Imam remained central, but his guidance came now through appointed representatives and symbolic authority. This shift was not a betrayal of the past. It was its evolution. The assassins, once feared as clandestine killers, were becoming something else, a trans-regional community with spiritual depth and worldly engagement. They carried with them not only memories of lost fortresses, but models of learning, self-governance, and mutual aid. One of the most significant moments in this evolution was the appearance of the Khoja tradition, a South Asian Ismaili community that blended local customs with inherited doctrine. Through poetry, ritual, and social organization, the Khojas preserved the essence of Nizari faith even as it changed its outer forms. Their oral texts spoke of hidden meanings, divine presence, and the necessity of taqiyya, not as deception, but as dignity in the face of overwhelming power. This cultural fluidity would become a defining trait of Ismailism. Unlike many traditions that sought to preserve identity through rigidity, the Nizaris embraced the possibility of change. They saw the Imam not just as a teacher of timeless truths, but as a guide through time, shaping practice according to context, ensuring continuity not by sameness, but by resonance. And in this way, the legacy of the assassins quietly outlived their enemies. The empires that crushed Alamut are gone. The kings they terrified are dust. But the people they inspired still gather in prayer, still study, still build. They no longer strike from the shadows, but they endure, a testament to the power of belief that adapts rather than breaks. The transformation of the Nizari community from mountain strongholds to urban diasporas marked a profound redefinition of power. No longer able to rely on geographic isolation or military deterrence, they turned inward, to culture, intellect, and cohesion. This quiet revolution would shape the trajectory of their future and the values they brought into the modern era. In the centuries that followed, The office of the imam adapted with each generation, hidden for long periods, then semi-visible, and finally emerging publicly in the 19th century. The imams guided their followers not with commands from fortresses, but with counsel from amidst the people. Their leadership moved with the times, evolving from spiritual authority to also include civic and social leadership. In a way, this return to visibility completed a long cycle, one that had begun with Hasan-i Sabbah's secluded vision in the mountains and now flowered in the open cities of modern society. It was during the colonial period in British India that the modern phase of Ismaili identity began to crystallize. The community faced new challenges: legal status, religious reform, cultural preservation, and the imamate responded dynamically. Aga Khan Furn, recognized as a princely figure by the British, became the first imam to bear the title publicly in generations. This recognition was not merely symbolic. It positioned the imamate as a bridge between East and West, between tradition and modernity. The Aga Khans who followed would deepen this role. They focused not only on preserving faith, but on advancing education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for their followers and beyond. Institutions like the Aga Khan Development Network emerged from this ethos, practical expressions of spiritual values in a changing world. The assassins had once operated in secrecy and silence. Their descendants now embraced transparency and service, yet the past was never abandoned. The ruins of Alamut and the memory of sacrifice continued to serve as touchstones, not as blueprints for revival, but as reminders of what had been endured. The Nizari ethos remained centered on knowledge, adaptability, and ethical leadership. These were the weapons of the present, honed in the crucible of the past. In contemporary times, the Ismaili community is spread across continents, multilingual, multicultural, and remarkably cohesive. This cohesion does not come from dogma, but from shared history and purpose. Schools, hospitals, cultural centers, and mosques carry forward not just faith, but a way of being in the world, engaged, ethical, and resilient. And still, the shadow of the assassin lingers, not as a threat, but as a memory of what it took to survive. In a world that often seeks to flatten identity, to commodify belief, the Nizaris offer an alternative, a tradition that remembers the cost of survival and chooses to pay it in knowledge, not blood. This evolution, from fidai to philanthropist, from fortress to foundation, is not a contradiction. It is the fullest expression of continuity. It honors the past not by repeating its forms, but by carrying forward its values. And in doing so, it ensures that the questions first asked in Alamut continue to echo. What is truth? What is worth dying for? And more importantly now, what is worth living for? The legacy of the assassins, filtered through centuries of transformation, raises a final paradox. How does a movement born in secrecy and conflict become a force for peace and development? How does the memory of blades become the foundation for bridges between cultures, generations, and faiths? To answer that, one must understand that the Nizaris were never defined solely by violence. The acts of assassination, as shocking and strategic as they were, constituted only one dimension of a much broader vision. Even during the height of their clandestine activity, the assassins were scholars, administrators, builders. Their fortresses housed not only soldiers, but scribes. Their strategies included education, negotiation, and long-term planning. In the modern era, these quieter threads became dominant. Under successive imams, the community turned toward the world with a new kind of ambition: to serve. This service was rooted in deeply held values: intellect, compassion, pluralism, and dignity. From East Africa to Canada, from Pakistan to Portugal, Ismaili communities established schools, clinics, and cultural programs not merely for their own benefit, but for the betterment of society at large. This outward engagement reflects the inward resilience that sustained them through centuries of marginalization. The assassins, once exiles and fugitives, became global citizens. Their institutions emphasized dialogue over division, collaboration over conquest. And while the myths persist of cloaked killers and hidden knives, those who know their real history understand that the truest blade they wield today is the sharpness of mind, the precision of compassion. The ruins of Alamut remain in the Iranian highlands, weathered and silent. No banners fly from its towers, no sentries guard its gates, but it is not forgotten. Pilgrims still climb its broken paths. Historians still study its stones, and in the hearts of those who remember, it stands, not as a monument to fear, but as a symbol of perseverance. And perhaps that is the greatest triumph of all. Not survival alone, but transformation. Not the echo of violence, but the enduring call to seek truth, to serve others, and to live with purpose. The assassins have become more than a footnote in the chronicles of war. They have become a chapter in the human story of adaptation, meaning, and hope. There are lessons in their rise and fall, in their secrecy and their openness, in their sword and their scholarship. But above all, there is a question they leave behind. How can one remain true to a vision when the world demands compromise? For the Nizaris, the answer lay not in retreating from history, but in engaging it, with eyes open, with minds sharp, and with hearts steady. That is the legacy of the mountain citadel, not its fall, but its echo. An echo that still speaks if one chooses to listen. While the historical narrative of the assassins often focuses on their dramatic actions and political maneuverings, less attention is paid to the social life that existed behind the walls of their fortresses. But to understand them fully, one must look beyond their operations and explore the inner fabric of the communities they built, tight-knit, structured, and imbued with a sense of shared destiny. Inside the mountain strongholds, daily life was marked by a rhythm of devotion, discipline, and education. Unlike the bustling cities of the plains, these citadels were quiet, inward-focused, and resilient. Food was grown on terraced slopes or brought up by caravan. Water was carefully stored in cisterns. Waste was managed with care to avoid contamination. Every detail of infrastructure revealed a people prepared for long periods of isolation and siege. Children grew up within the protection of stone and snow, learning not only to read and recite scripture, but also to observe, analyze, and prepare. Instruction was not confined to theology. It included philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and languages. From an early age, youth were trained to be both spiritually grounded and intellectually agile. They learned not to fear the world beyond the walls, but to understand it, to navigate it with caution and purpose. Women, too, played a role in these communities, though historical records are sparse. While the public face of the assassins was male, the internal functioning of their society could not have endured without the participation of women in family life, education, and logistics. In oral traditions, women appear as keepers of memory, bearers of identity, and transmitters of values to the next generation. In this way, the resilience of the community was as much familial as it was ideological. Elders held honored roles. Their experience was drawn upon in matters of judgment, counsel, and conflict resolution. They were the memory of the fortress, living links to past generations, keepers of custom and continuity. It was through them that the philosophical foundations of the order were preserved, not only in books, but in practice. Festivals were modest but meaningful. Special days were marked by shared meals, recitations, and quiet celebration. There was no opulence, no public spectacle, but there was solidarity, a collective awareness of the rarity and fragility of their way of life. In the face of persecution from all sides, they found joy in survival and meaning in each act of endurance. These details may seem small beside the legends of political intrigue, but they are the true pillars of longevity. The assassins did not survive for generations because they were feared. They survived because they were rooted. Rooted in ideas, yes, but also in daily practice, in relationships, in ritual and care. In their quiet corners, they crafted a way of life that could hold through fire and betrayal. They taught their children to think critically, to remember wisely, and to act deliberately. They built not only fortresses but families, not only a doctrine but a culture, and that culture, more than any dagger or decree, is what carried them through the darkest times. In it, we find the human side of their story, not of killers and targets, but of neighbors and teachers, of students and mothers, of people who believed that even in a world of war, it was still worth building something that would last. The intellectual tradition fostered within the walls of Alamut and its sister fortresses was one of the most enduring legacies of the Nizari Ismailis. In a time when most knowledge was guarded by religious elites or restricted by empire, the assassins created a space where inquiry was encouraged and preserved. This commitment to learning did not vanish with the fall of their castles. It carried forward into the diaspora, shaping generations of scholars, poets, and thinkers. In Alamut, the library was not merely a repository of texts, but a hub of discourse. Philosophers debated ethics, scribes copied manuscripts by candlelight, and students committed lines of logic and theology to memory. The walls echoed not just with drills and warnings, but with questions. What is truth? Who has the right to lead? What lies beneath the surface of law? Much of the literature preserved in these mountain fortresses was Ismaili in character, focusing on the esoteric interpretations of Scripture and the role of the imam in guiding the faithful. But there were also texts on Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, and Arabic medicine. This eclecticism was no accident. It reflected a worldview that saw no contradiction between faith and reason, between divine revelation and empirical understanding. Hasan-i Sabbah himself was known not only as a leader, but as a scholar. His writings, though few survive intact, suggest a mind deeply engaged with questions of epistemology and governance. He advocated for critical thought, for disciplined self-awareness, and for allegiance not to tradition for its own sake, but to knowledge pursued with integrity. His emphasis on inner meaning over surface law placed him in tension with more literalist religious movements, and that tension continues to animate theological. After the fall of Alamut, many manuscripts were lost or destroyed. Yet enough survived in hidden libraries, in travelers' accounts, and in the memories of disciples to allow fragments of this tradition to endure. Later, Ismaili centers in Yemen, Central Asia, and India would continue the work, producing treatises on metaphysics, cosmology, and ethics that drew from both Islamic and pre-Islamic sources. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a renaissance of Ismaili scholarship has brought many of these texts back into circulation. Academic institutions, such as the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, now house vast collections of manuscripts and support research into the intellectual legacy of the Nizari tradition. Conferences, translations, and digital archives ensure that what once had to be whispered in secret can now be studied openly. This reclaiming of history is more than academic. It is existential. It restores to the Nizari story its full dimension, its depth beyond the blade. It shows that what was feared was not just a militant order, but a way of thinking that could not be controlled. A worldview that prized depth over dogma, meaning over mechanism, and spirit over surface. In our own time, when knowledge is once again contested, when information flows fast but wisdom seems scarce, the example of Alamut reminds us that education is not just a tool for advancement, it is an act of defiance, an affirmation that in a world built on force, the mind still matters, the question still matters. And sometimes, the quiet work of learning is the most revolutionary act of all. To grasp the full resonance of the assassin's legacy, it is helpful to consider how they have been imagined and reimagined through the lenses of different civilizations. Their story has been reshaped countless times, not only by historians, but by artists, writers, and political thinkers seeking to find in them a symbol, a warning, or a guide. In medieval Europe, the assassins were rendered almost mythological. The stories that filtered through Crusader encounters were exaggerated and often fantastical. Gardens of paradise, drug-induced trances, and blind loyalty to an omnipotent master. These tales had little basis, in fact, but they stuck. They became part of the Western imagination, a strange fusion of fear and fascination. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, European writers increasingly used the assassins as a metaphor for manipulation and political assassination. Their name became shorthand for treachery. Voltaire, Montesquieu, and others mentioned them in their critiques of religion and authority. The historical complexity of the Nizaris was lost beneath layers of ideological projection. In the modern era, the assassins have appeared in novels, films, and games as dark anti-heroes, cloaked, agile, enigmatic. The popular video game franchise Assassin's Creed, for example, builds upon the mythos of the Nizari order while largely departing from historical fact. And yet, even these fictionalized versions often touch on a deeper truth, that the real power of the assassins lay not in physical violence, but in purpose, mystery, and autonomy. Outside the West, portrayals of the assassins have also evolved. In Islamic contexts, their memory remains complex, viewed by some as heretical extremists, by others as misunderstood reformers. In contemporary Iran and Syria, the ruins of their fortresses are national heritage sites, but their history is still contested. Scholars work to reframe the narrative, to place the assassins not in the category of anomaly, but within the broader currents of Islamic political and intellectual history. There is an ongoing struggle between myth and history, between demonization and understanding. And in that struggle, one can find a mirror of larger societal tensions, between control and freedom, between conformity and conscience. What the assassins represent, more than anything, is the possibility that small, intentional communities can challenge dominant narratives. That power need not always flow from the center. That silence can speak. And that the margins of history often hold its most radical insights. This symbolic power is why the assassins endure, not as a military force, but as an idea. They were not the only ones to resist from the edges, but they did so with such clarity and consistency that their memory outlived their presence. And so the story continues, not just in texts and ruins, but in every attempt to live deliberately in an age of noise, in every act of thoughtful defiance, in every refusal to be defined by what is easiest to believe. The assassins remind us that identity is not inherited, it is chosen, and that even centuries later, the power of that choice still resonates. Among the lesser-known legacies of the assassins is their influence on the philosophical traditions that threaded through the Islamic world in the centuries following their decline. While their reputation became entangled with myth, the deeper layers of their thought, especially their metaphysics and esotericism, filtered into broader currents of Islamic intellectual life. The Nizari Ismaili worldview was built around the concept of hidden meaning, batin, layered beneath external reality, zahir. This belief that all things, including scripture, law, and ritual, carried a deeper significance shaped their theology profoundly. In a world obsessed with literal interpretation and visible hierarchy, the assassins taught that truth was not always obvious, that the inner eye mattered more than the outer gaze. Such an approach had precedent in earlier Ismaili thinkers, but under Hasan-i Sabbah and his successors, it took on a radical intensity. Knowledge was not just a matter of study, but of initiation. One did not merely read texts. One passed through levels of meaning under the guidance of a teacher, ultimately preparing the soul to perceive the Imam as the living link between the divine and the human. This emphasis on inner truth had both liberating and dangerous implications. On one hand, it allowed the faithful to remain spiritually connected even when outward practice was constrained by persecution. On the other, it made them appear secretive, subversive, even deceptive to those who did not share their vision. To the Sunni majority and even to some Shia groups, this was unacceptable. A faith that cloaked its doctrines in mystery invited suspicion. But this interpretive depth also contributed to the richness of Islamic philosophy. Ideas about cycles of revelation, the necessity of spiritual guidance, and the multiple layers of reality found echoes in Sufi poetry, in Neoplatonic commentaries, and in mystical treatises across the Muslim world. Though the assassins as a political force diminished, the intellectual seeds they scattered bore fruit in unexpected places. In the Mughal courts of India, in the Sufi lodges of Central Asia, and even in the rationalist schools of the Ottoman Empire, traces of this legacy can be found. Philosophers and poets alike drew from the well of ideas that the Ismailis had helped to deepen, sometimes knowingly, sometimes through transmission chains long detached from their original context. This hidden contribution may be the most assassin-like of all. Just as their agents once moved invisibly through cities, so too did their ideas seep quietly into the veins of culture. Not all who repeated them knew their source. Not all who benefited from them understood the price that had been paid to keep them alive. And so, in the end, the assassins shaped history not just by removing obstacles, but by introducing questions. They asked what it meant to know, what it meant to see, what it meant to follow not a rule book, but a person, a teacher, a guide, an imam. Those questions are still being asked. In classrooms and seminaries, in debates over tradition and reform, in the solitary reflection of those who seek meaning behind the veil of the obvious. And in that seeking, the voice of Alamut still speaks, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of those who know that truth, like power, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits to be discovered. The physical landscapes once dominated by the assassins still bear silent witness to their story. From the jagged ridges of Rudbar to the arid highlands of Masyaf, the stones of their fortresses remain, worn by wind and time. These ruins are more than relics. They are symbols of a vanished world, shaped not by empires, but by ideals. Visitors to Alamut today must hike narrow, steep paths that once echoed with the footsteps of fida'i and scholars. There are no grand gates or marble palaces, only the foundations of walls, the remains of storage rooms, and traces of watchtowers that once scanned the horizon for invaders. What survives is not grandeur, but endurance, not spectacle, but silence. And yet, the silence speaks. It speaks of a people who chose the mountain over the city, the hard path over the easy one, who lived not for comfort, but for conviction, who believed that even in the smallest space, a great truth could take root. These places were not meant to last forever, but they were meant to inspire, to challenge, to survive in memory long after their stones fell. Preservation efforts have begun in some areas, though often underfunded and fragmented. Scholars, archaeologists, and local caretakers work to protect what remains, to document the fragments, and to educate a new generation about what once was. In this task, they are themselves heirs to the assassins, guardians of something fragile, vital, and almost forgotten. In Syria, the fortress of Masyaf stands in better condition than most. Its towers have been partially restored, and its layout offers a glimpse into the strategic brilliance of its designers. From its heights, one can see the plains below, once the domain of crusaders and rival dynasties. It is easy to imagine the quiet calculations made there. Who must be warned? Who must be watched? Who must be stopped? But the greatest restoration is not of stone. It is of story. To remember the assassins is to remember the power of belief, the cost of dissent, and the courage of those who live between the lines of accepted history. In a world where monuments often celebrate conquest, these ruins commemorate something rarer: principled resistance. They are reminders that not all who built did so with bricks. Some built with questions, with courage, and with community. They built not only for their time, but for a future that might one day listen. To stand in Alamut is to feel that future. To look down from its ridge is to understand what it meant to see not only the valley, but the world differently, and to carry that vision forward, not as nostalgia, but as a challenge. For the story of the assassins is not done. It is not fixed in stone. It is alive in thought, in search, in every quiet act of resilience. And so the path continues, not back into the past, but forward into the possible. As we arrive at the final chapter in the story of the assassins, what remains is not merely a chronicle of events, but a meditation on meaning. Theirs was a journey not only across mountains and centuries, but across the inner terrain of the human spirit, across doubt, conviction, secrecy, and vision. Few movements have balanced so precariously between survival and significance. The assassins remind us that history is not just what survives, but what refuses to be forgotten. Their legacy is a constellation of paradoxes. A secretive sect that shaped public history, a feared force that fostered learning, a defeated community that triumphed in transformation. They began as rebels, endured as wanderers, and emerged in modernity as a global people rooted in memory. Their story asks hard questions of us. What is loyalty when the world offers no place for your beliefs? What is justice when courts are weapons of the powerful? What is hope when history is written against you? The assassins had answers, not always comfortable, but always committed. They chose knowledge over ignorance, principle over passivity, and meaning over safety. And they paid the price. But they also gave the world something rare, a model of faith not afraid to think, of discipline that made room for inquiry, of resistance that never lost sight of purpose. In an age where information multiplies and truth fractures, their quiet certainty feels both alien and essential. To remember the assassins is not to celebrate assassination. It is to recall that even the smallest spark of conviction can burn through the darkness of oppression. That ideas, once lit, cannot be so easily extinguished. That even in ruins there can be clarity. So, let this final thought remain. Alamut was never just a place. It was and remains a possibility. A symbol of what belief can build, what courage can defend, and what vision can outlast. The assassins are gone, but the mountain still watches. The wind still whispers, and the path still climbs. In the centuries following the collapse of the Nizari state, the memory of the assassins became more than just history. It became a metaphor. Across cultures and generations, their image was appropriated, distorted, romanticized, and politicized. Yet beneath these layers of meaning, something essential remained. The sense that they had touched a nerve in human consciousness, a truth about the balance between visibility and influence, between belief and fear. The very ambiguity of the assassins became their strength in collective memory. Were they zealots or visionaries, martyrs or manipulators, rebels or loyalists to a higher ideal? The answers often said more about the questioner than about the subjects themselves. In literature and lore, they became reflections of our own anxieties about control, loyalty, freedom, and the cost of conviction. What endured more than anything was the fascination with how such a small group could shake the foundations of kingdoms. In this, they became a timeless symbol for the power of the few against the many, not through brute force, but through precision, strategy, and unshakable purpose. They taught us that influence does not always need a throne, that disruption does not always require violence, and that the greatest revolutions often begin in silence. The teachings of the assassins also offer a compelling counter-narrative to modern misconceptions about medieval Islam. In a time when reductionist views still linger, views that see the Islamic Golden Age only through the lens of military conquest or religious orthodoxy, the Nizaris stand as evidence of an alternative legacy, one rooted in philosophy, science, and spiritual depth. Their very existence challenges the false dichotomy between reason and faith, between tradition and progress. Their commitment to the inner interpretation of Scripture, showed that meaning was not fixed, that understanding required humility and guidance. Their embrace of *taqiya*, the discretion necessary for survival, reflected not cowardice, but wisdom, a moral navigation of a world where openness could be fatal. These practices were not signs of weakness, but of strength, of a community mature enough to adapt without abandoning its soul. The world today, fractured by noise and spectacle, could learn much from such quiet resilience. The assassins never sought popularity. They sought clarity. They did not aim to dominate the world, only to protect a space in which their truth could survive. And in doing so, they revealed something profound, that sometimes the most powerful act is simply to endure with purpose. Their spiritual descendants continue that work, not in fortresses, but in classrooms, clinics, libraries, and dialogue. They carry forward the same questions, adapted to a new era. How do we live meaningfully? How do we lead ethically? How do we protect what matters when the world is indifferent or hostile? And so the legend of the assassins becomes more than myth. It becomes mirror, a reflection of our deepest fears and highest aspirations, a challenge to the complacency of empire, a whisper that truth may yet survive the flame. What remains is not their knives, but their questions, not their silence, but their echo, not their fall, but their example. To understand the lasting allure of the assassins is to grapple with the human fascination for control in chaos, meaning in mystery, and discipline in a disordered world. They were never the most powerful group of their age. They held no great capitals, commanded no vast armies, and minted no currency of empire. Yet they remain unforgettable because they stood for something rare and unyielding, belief shaped into deliberate action. They mastered the art of balance, between seen and unseen, between force and subtlety, between isolation and engagement. This mastery was not accidental. It came from necessity, from a need to survive in a world that had little tolerance for divergence, for those who believed differently, acted independently, or refused the compromises that safety often demands. In many ways, the assassins anticipated modern notions of decentralized networks. Their fortress society functioned less like a top-down monarchy and more like an adaptable node system, each outpost connected to a central vision but able to act with local autonomy. Messages were carried by trusted couriers. Commands were interpreted with insight, not blind obedience. The strength of the system lay in its resilience. Cut off one node, and the rest endured. Their code of discipline, while strict, was internalized. It was not enforced by threats alone, but by the moral authority of the imam and the elders who interpreted his will. This gave the assassins a rare combination of structure and agility, bound by purpose, but not rigid, focused, but not fanatical. They lived by preparation and patience, not by impulse. This emphasis on patience may be their most radical legacy in a modern age that idolizes speed. The assassins trained for years before ever receiving a mission, if they received one at all. Some never did, and yet remained loyal, committed to readiness. In that stillness lay a power few could understand, a strength not of the moment, but of the long view. It is this long view that resonates across time. The assassins were not reactionaries. They did not kill for shock or spectacle or immediate gain. They acted within a strategy that looked across years, even decades. Their interventions were rare precisely because they were valuable, measured not in casualties but in calculated impact. One death to prevent a war, one message to delay a siege, one silence to outlast a storm. Modern strategists and intelligence scholars have, knowingly or not, echoed their approach. The value of asymmetry, of psychological dominance, of perception as battlefield, all trace lines back to the shadow cast by Alamut. In this sense, the assassins were not merely historical actors. They were innovators in how power could be conceived and used. But they were also human. They feared, hoped, bled, and prayed. Their children laughed in courtyards. Their elders argued over texts. Their cooks prepared meals. Their scribes made errors. Their guards fell asleep. To mythologize them too completely is to forget their reality. And that reality, with all its contradictions, is far more instructive than the legend. Because in the end, the assassins did something extraordinary. They crafted meaning under siege. They preserved identity in a time of erasure. And they showed that even in a world designed to silence them, the truth they carried could still be spoken, if not aloud, then in the choices they made and the lives they led. The way we interpret the story of the assassins today says as much about our current values as it does about the medieval world they inhabited. In a time when surveillance is omnipresent, when power is often hidden behind algorithms and financial systems, the figure of the assassin, calm, unseen, purposeful, emerges not only as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of focused agency in a distracted age. It is no accident that modern media has resurrected the mythos of the assassin with such vigor. In the clutter of contemporary narratives, the idea of someone acting with singular intent, be it for justice, revenge, or truth, cuts through the noise. Whether romanticized or feared, the assassin archetype speaks to something ancient, the desire for clarity, for autonomy, for decisive action in a world often paralyzed by indecision. But this modern lens can also distort. It turns a complex movement into an aesthetic, a philosophy into a costume. To reclaim the deeper wisdom of the Nizaris requires peeling back the layers of entertainment and propaganda to uncover the discipline that shaped them. Not violence for its own sake, but the slow, patient crafting of a worldview that merged the metaphysical with the tactical. One of the enduring lessons of the assassins is their refusal to separate the spiritual from the political. For them, action in the world was a reflection of inner alignment. The blade was never random. It followed contemplation, counsel, and context. Their philosophy was not escapist mysticism nor cold realism, but a fusion of the two, built on the belief that inner clarity empowered outer precision. This dual emphasis on interior and exterior mastery is rare. Many traditions cultivate one at the expense of the other. But the assassins trained both the heart and the hand, the mind and the mission. They understood that without conviction, action is chaos, and without preparation, belief is inert. Such integration is difficult. It requires consistency, mentorship, and a structure of accountability. In the mountain fortresses, these conditions were created through isolation and ritual. In the modern world, where such spaces are harder to maintain, the challenge becomes one of adaptation. How to preserve intention in a sea of distraction. The Nizari legacy suggests a few answers. Prioritize depth over volume. Build communities that value inquiry. Hold silence as sacred. And above all, recognize that endurance is not passivity. It is a kind of strength, a strategy of its own. The assassins did not endure because they shouted louder or struck harder. They endured because they moved deliberately, thought long, and built structures that could weather both assault and time. Their fall was tragic, but not total. Their ideas survived because they were carried not only in texts and ruins, but in habits of thought and ways of being. To live like an assassin, then, is not to kill. It is to choose with care, to move with purpose, to honor knowledge, and to act not when convenient, but when necessary. That discipline may be their greatest gift, and in an era increasingly defined by reaction, it is a gift worth remembering. The assassin's ability to persist as a subject of historical, cultural, and philosophical inquiry rests in their refusal to be easily categorized. They confound the binaries that so often dominate our understanding of the past: heretic or saint, villain or hero, shadow or light. Their complexity is not a flaw of the narrative, but its strength. They force us to ask, what does it mean to resist? Not simply in the political sense, but in the existential one. What does it mean to hold to your truth when the world refuses to recognize it? What kind of internal scaffolding must be built to live for something the world deems invisible? Or worse, dangerous? In the case of the Nizaris, the answer was layered. It began with a cosmology that placed the Imam at the center, not merely as a political leader, but as a living conduit to divine understanding. This spiritual foundation grounded their worldly actions in something more than strategy. It gave them a telos, a direction that outlasted crises and collapses. Their sense of time was shaped not by the immediacy of war, but by cycles of revelation and concealment. To them, truth was not a sudden flash, but a gradual unveiling. Patience was not passive. It was a form of trust in the arc of history. This perspective enabled them to survive in exile, to rebuild after devastation, and to nurture hope in times of utter defeat. It also demanded immense discipline. In a world of empire, where might made right and visibility was equated with legitimacy, the Nizaris chose obscurity. They valued presence over performance, substance over display. Their teachers instructed generations in restraint, reminding them that not all truths are meant for every audience, and not all knowledge must be declared. And yet, their secrecy was never meant to be elitist. It was protective, a shield against persecution, a strategy of survival. They welcomed converts from many backgrounds, trained their initiates rigorously, and encouraged questioning within their circles. Their fortresses were schools as much as sanctuaries, their rituals spaces of communion as well as command. In this way, the assassins offer an unexpected lesson in leadership. Their authority was not built on charisma alone, nor on brute force, but on consistency. The word given was the word kept. The bond of allegiance was sacred not because it was coerced, but because it was earned through shared vision and mutual risk. This style of leadership, quiet, stable, and centered, contrasts sharply with the spectacle-driven models that dominate both past and present. It suggests a different kind of power, one that does not shout to be heard, but listens to remain wise. One that endures not by dominating the narrative, but by refusing to abandon its core. And perhaps that is the true measure of their legacy. Not that they were feared, or that they were misunderstood, but that they were faithful to a path, to a people, to a purpose. In a world that rewards compromise, they embodied a radical kind of integrity. That integrity still speaks even now from the silent stones of Alamut. It tells us that there is strength in stillness, clarity in complexity, and honor in holding fast to the unseen thread that binds one generation to the next. A thread that, once spun, may stretch far beyond the fortress, and even beyond time. If the assassins have anything to teach us today, it is not merely how to endure in hostile environments, but how to endure with dignity. Their story is one of navigation, through danger, through exile, through misunderstanding. But it is also a story of creative resistance, of refusing to be defined by the terms of their enemies. This refusal manifested in many ways. It was in their refusal to accept the legitimacy of rulers who claimed spiritual authority without insight. It was in their resistance to the flattening of faith into rules without meaning. It was in their insistence that knowledge was not just a tool of power, but a path to the divine. The Nizaris were not content to inherit dogma. They sought understanding. Their theology taught that beneath every verse, every law, every story, there lay a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. This made them dangerous to those who sought control through certainty. The assassins, in contrast, moved within ambiguity, drew strength from it, and made it a virtue. Their opponents called them liars, deceivers, heretics. But these accusations often revealed more about the fears of the accusers than the nature of the accused. The assassins lived in a way that questioned hierarchy, interrogated appearances, and asked whether the world as it is must always be so. Even their violence, when viewed historically, takes on a different character. It was not wanton or chaotic, but deliberate and strategic, targeted at individuals whose actions threatened the very possibility of Nizari survival. In an age where armies massacred cities, the assassins acted with surgical precision. This does not excuse bloodshed, but it frames it within a context few other movements can claim: the use of force not for conquest, but for preservation. What is remarkable is that such a worldview, so rooted in esoteric doctrine and medieval struggle, has survived into the present with its spirit intact. The Nizari Ismailis of today, under the leadership of the Aga Khan, continue to build institutions rooted in knowledge, ethics, and community. Their schools, universities, and humanitarian networks are not a break from the past, but its flowering. They demonstrate that the values forged in isolation and defended in secrecy can, with care, become tools for openness and peace. The same belief that sustained them under siege now animates their efforts to bridge cultures, alleviate poverty, and expand access to education. This is not a reinvention, but a revelation. The blade has become a beacon. And so the story turns full circle. From the mountains of Alamut to the global platforms of the 21st century, the Nizaris continue to model a path that merges faith and reason, heritage and innovation, memory and movement. They remind us that tradition is not a wall but a foundation, that secrecy can birth wisdom, that survival is more than endurance, it is transformation. And in that transformation, the assassins have left behind not a blueprint, but a question. What will you do with your clarity? What fortress will you build, not of stone, but of thought? What will you preserve, not with weapons, but with intention? These are not just questions for historians. They are questions for all of us. To speak of the assassins is ultimately to speak of legacy, not only the one they inherited, but the one they shaped and the one they leave behind. It is a legacy not just of resistance, but of resilience, not only of precision, but of principle. In their actions and absences, in their fortresses and philosophies, they charted a way of being that defied reduction. Much of what makes the assassins enduringly relevant lies in what they chose not to do. They did not seek imperial expansion. They did not impose belief by the sword, nor demand blind loyalty from the masses. They carved out space, physical and intellectual, for a different kind of life, one that valued introspection, community, and balance. This refusal to conform to dominant paradigms made them targets, but it also made them timeless. Their story has become a reservoir of meaning for those who find themselves at odds with the world, for thinkers and seekers, for reformers and radicals. In the quiet mountain paths of Alamut, they built something that outlived siege engines and sultans, an ethos. And that ethos, adaptability without surrender, action without noise, truth without spectacle, is perhaps more vital now than ever. We live in an age where visibility is currency, where declarations outweigh deliberation, where reaction often replaces reason. In such a context, the assassins whisper a counter-instruction. Be deliberate, choose wisely, move quietly, act with care, and above all, ground your work in something deeper than the moment. They also remind us that history is not merely what is recorded, but what is remembered. Much of their story was told by their enemies. The accounts that survive often drip with fear, distortion, and awe. And yet they persisted, not because their image was clear, but because their presence was real. That presence now takes new forms, in the libraries and development institutions led by their descendants, in the poetry, architecture, and ethics that bear the subtle imprint of their worldview, in the stories that continue to be told, challenged, and reimagined. What remains is not just stone and script, but signal, a signal that clarity can survive confusion, that structure can outlast violence, that memory, carefully guarded, can transcend forgetting. So, as the tale of the assassins winds toward its close, it leaves not an ending but an invitation to listen for the quiet places in history, to find strength in the margins, to ask not how loudly we speak but how deeply we mean. Because in the end, it was not their silence that defined them, but the purpose that filled it. And that purpose, once kindled, continues to burn, not in fire, but in thought, not in conquest, but in care, not in fear, but in the fierce clarity of those who choose to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. In tracing the arc of the assassin's legacy, one last theme stands clear: the quiet endurance of moral clarity in a world built on spectacle. This is not the kind of clarity that shouts to be seen or demands approval. It is the kind that holds its shape through storms, that walks unseen yet unwavering. The assassins were never designed to be remembered as conquerors. They were instead curators of continuity, stewards of a tradition that could not be openly celebrated, but could never be truly extinguished. What they built, under threat in secret on mountaintops, was not a fleeting rebellion, but a slow revolution of presence. Presence in the sense of rootedness, of knowing one's purpose and aligning one's life around it. In 1,000 ways, large and small, this presence shaped the communities that followed them. It shaped the discipline of their learning, the humility of their leadership, and the quiet dignity with which they moved through both visibility and erasure. Their model of leadership, grounded in ethical responsibility and intellectual guidance, stands in stark contrast to many dominant models across history. Where others ruled by fear, they led by example. Where others imposed, they invited. And where others sought to be seen, they worked to see clearly. Even now, their teachings remind us that the most important battles may not be waged on battlefields or in public squares, but in the quiet negotiations of the heart, in the choices made when no one is watching, in the cultivation of an inner life that can withstand both exile and acclaim. In an age where institutions rise and fall, where ideology is often untethered from empathy, the memory of the assassins offers a different way, a way where knowledge is sacred, where faith is dynamic, and where leadership begins not with power, but with principle. As we step away from their story, we are left not with instructions, but with inspiration. Not a map, but a mirror. They do not tell us what to do, but they challenge us to ask, what do I believe in enough to build slowly? What will I guard when no one else sees? What will I carry, not for applause, but because it is right? For in the end, the assassins were not a question of death, but of devotion, not of disappearance, but of presence, not of domination, but of meaning, lived out in 1,000 hidden acts, in silence that speaks, in wisdom that waits. And if their story has endured, it is because some truths are stronger than empires. Some paths run deeper than roads, and some fires once lit never die.